You stand on the shore of the ocean watching the tide come in. You sense the call of the sea beckoning to take you further. You step forward little by little, not knowing what to expect, but expecting more. You keep going as the ocean calls you to enter in to deeper waters.
Hello everyone and welcome to the Deeper Waters podcast. I am Nick Peters, your host, seeking to bring you the very best in Christian scholarship and apologetics. And yes, today we're back to Christian scholarship and apologetics. We had Tim O'Neill on last week, our first atheist guest, helping us to destroy the idea that the so-called Middle Ages were Dark Ages, and dealing with someone we're talking about even more today, and that's Richard Carrier, who you all know I like to say is my favorite unemployed party and most prominent internet blogger who's banned from Skepticon, Richard Carrier. But, you know, the thing with Richard Carrier is a lot of scholars don't really pay a lot of attention to him. If you're on the internet and you're an atheist, you tend to think he's the greatest thing since sliced bread. Many people in scholarship just don't know. But what if someone in scholarship did decide to look at his arguments? In fact, let's go so far as say, I don't know, they decide to do their dissertation on him. Well, that is the case here. Ross Hickling actually decided to do that, looking at Carrier's arguments for resurrection. Who is he? He's retired as a senior inspector of the U.S. Marshals Service in 2014 after serving in federal and local law enforcement for 26 years. During his career in law enforcement, he functioned in various investigative roles to include a narcotics detective, SWAT team operative, threat investigator, seized assets investigator, fugitive investigator, and sex offender investigations coordinator. Midway through his career at the U.S. Marshals Service, Ross began to prepare for a career in ministry after retirement when he began his seminary education. Since that time, Ross has earned a B.S. in religion at Liberty, an M.A. in religion at Liberty again, and an M.A. in Christian apologetics from Biola, and a Ph.D. in missiology Christian apologetics from Northwest University, Potchefstroom campus, South Africa. My apologies if I totally botched that wording. Ross worked under the supervision of Professor Dr. Hinks Toker while completing his thesis at NWU, Potch, critiquing a skeptic's challenge to the resurrection of Jesus Christ. During his time with the U.S. Marshals Service and while completing his studies, Ross realized the need to bring evidentiary principles to his study of Christian apologetics. Since retiring, Ross founded Shield Your Faith, an organization dedicated to sharing the great reasons for faith in Jesus Christ from an evidentiary perspective. Took part in an international apologetics campaign in the Philippines, South Africa, and currently teaches apologetics on a seminary level at Charlotte Christian College and Theological Seminary. He is currently the chapter director at Oratio Christi Club at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. He's married to Andrea, he can tell us, his lovely wife of 29 years, has 2 adult children, and resides in Connellsville, North Carolina. Dr. Hickling, welcome to the Deeper Waters podcast.
Hey, great, Nick. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Is your wife Andrea or Andrea?
It's Andrea.
Okay. You gotta make sure you get the wife's name right on the air, you know?
Oh, definitely. That's definitely something you definitely need to do. But you did do pretty well with the Potchefstroom pronunciation, so congrats on that.
Oh, good. And I'm kind of curious, is this your first interview on this topic?
It is, actually.
Nice. Glad I got to you first here. Okay. So if my audience doesn't know much about you, we've heard your academic bio, but how did you get to be doing what you're doing?
Right. So I've always been active in social issues with the intersection of culture and my faith since my very earliest days, and going into prisons and hanging out with prisoners and singing and just sharing my faith from a very early age again. And then my father, he also was an employee of something called the Freedom Council, which was an educational group that was dedicated to showing the roots, the Christian roots, the Judeo-Christian roots of our country. So he started bringing home books for me to read, and I was in my teens, and so I started reading way back then about the intersection of my faith with culture and how we need to be involved with our culture. And so as time progressed from that early time, I ended up becoming a law enforcement professional, 5 years with the Portsmouth City, Virginia Police Department. Had a wonderful experience there, and then was lucky enough, fortunate enough to go on with the U.S. Marshal Service with my law enforcement career. And about halfway through, I started thinking about, hey, I'm getting kind of old now, so I might as well think about what I do after my law enforcement career. So that's when I started in earnest my career, my academic career with the Liberty University degrees, Biola, et cetera. And as I started wading into my scholastic career, I then became acquainted with the claims of a number of these atheist authors, who I would call maybe a little bit radical, because it seemed like they were very inflamed against Christianity. Instead of giving a positive view of what their beliefs are and were, they started more attacking the Christian faith. And that's sort of what got me into looking at their books and their writings. And that's when I became acquainted with Richard Carrier, and he was making some strong claims about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So as a curious person, somebody who's an investigator who likes to dig, I started looking at his material. And so that's kind of how I got involved with this project.
Mm-hmm. Have you had any personal or email interactions with Carrier yet?
No, I have not, but look forward maybe to some in the future.
Yeah, I've already told you what to expect in the book review, the whole things like liar, doesn't understand, didn't read, things like that and such.
Okay, well, I'm always willing to take some constructive criticism, so I'm willing to hear whatever he has. But of course, in my law enforcement career, I am used to taking abuse at some points from people in that sort of field. So if somebody abuses me in that way, it shouldn't upset me too much.
Now, something that readers might be interested in, they might want to upfront your book on this topic, and we'll be telling people how they can buy it. It doesn't yet at this point deal with the whole thing that he's come out with in the past few years, that Jesus never even existed, for instance. Your book mainly focuses on the resurrection, right?
Yeah, it does focus on the resurrection. It does touch on the fact that he does believe that Jesus Christ was a mythical character, and that he uses these arguments to prove that contention.
Do you think there could be a future book coming out from you specifically looking at his book on the historicity of Jesus?
I mean, this sort of treats some of that material when we're talking about dying and rising gods, because again, he does rely on that. He does rely on the fact that he believes that if there were disciples of Jesus, that they hallucinated it, the contradictions, etc. And of course, relying on the early Christians relying on dying and rising gods as a foundation for the resurrection that they created. So yeah, I mean, it kind of does go into some of that material, definitely, but it doesn't actually analyze his entire perspective, because that would be a very large work, because he is a very busy writer.
Now, we're going to spend some time talking about each section of the book, looking at the parts, because there's 3 of them altogether. But let's start with a place that many people don't start, and that's actually your methodology. I mean, how do you go about evaluating what counts as evidence and such?
Right. Well, the first thing that came to me as I started looking at this material was that my career as a law enforcement investigator really was applicable to applying it to this discussion, because like the resurrection claims of Christians, his claim that Jesus Christ is a mythical character and these other things that I have in my book are historical claims, because the Christian would say Jesus Christ historically arose from the dead, but then Richard Carrier would historically say that Jesus Christ did not exist, and these are some of the reasons why. So these are all questions about historicity, and because of the fact that these are questions of historicity, then actual evidentiary principles would apply. So what I did is I basically went back into my career and sort of synthesized and distilled all of the accepted principles of evidence that investigators use and that also judges and juries use as well to come upon whether evidence is reliable or relevant or not. So that's what I did. I went back into my career, and in particular, I went to the federal pattern jury instructions that judges across the United States and other countries use to advise juries on how to handle evidence. So that's one set of documents that I went to. I also went to the Federal Rules of Evidence, which are very gold standard rules that are used every day across the country to talk about how we should use evidence. So these are the two basic documents that I use, the Federal Rule of Evidence and also Federal Pattern Jury Instructions, to distill these accepted principles of evidence that I use.
With all the hearings going on about the Supreme Court and such right now, people are having a lot of talk about what counts as evidence and what doesn't. So could you flesh that out a little bit more? I mean, what are some of these rules and such that are used?
Well, right. Thank you. Yeah. Basically, there's some very simple principles. This isn't rocket science. Basically, you're looking for people that would be witnesses directly, historical witnesses. In the case of these claims of the resurrection, do you have historical witnesses that discuss what they saw and what they heard? And also, do they have the ability to actually have heard and have seen what they're talking about? So that's that's one principle of evidence. You have circumstantial evidence or indirect evidence, where you can look at a set of circumstances and then you can come upon looking at the circumstantial evidence, you can start making inferences by looking at a chain of circumstances or events that happen. That's another way to look at evidence. And of course, you've been hearing a lot about in the hearings about corroboration or strengthening or confirmation of evidence. And that is another principle that's important in this work is, are Carrier's claims corroborated, or are the Christian claims corroborated about the resurrection? So that's another important principle. Of course, in doing any sort of exposition from evidentiary principles, you're looking for relevant evidence. Is the actual information that somebody's using as evidence, does it actually tie to what they are trying to prove, the exact point that they're trying to prove? So relevant evidence is something that's also very important. That's Federal Rule of Evidence 401. And also, if you're talking about facts, if somebody's saying, hey, I have a fact to undergird what I'm trying to prove, are your facts actually based on proof? So you need to actually supply proof to your supposed facts, or else they shouldn't be considered as facts. So these are a number of the basic principles that I'm using as criteria to analyze not only the resurrection accounts in the New Testament, but also Richard Carrier's assertions to the resurrection as well.
You mean when we're arguing with our atheist friends on the internet or in person, they can't just come up and say, I have an opinion, therefore that counts as evidence?
Right, exactly. If somebody has conjecture, well, we can take it as conjecture. It might be something interesting to consider. Or if somebody says, this is my opinion, well, I mean, we can listen to it as opinion, but if he's saying that I have evidence, then what is your evidence? It needs to be one of these forms. It either needs to be a historic witness that you're relying upon, somebody who's written a book, or it needs to be a set of circumstances that prove their point, and it needs to be relevant, not just my opinion, like you said, Nick.
Okay, well, let's consider this, like, in light of the hearings going on, I mean, Ford came forward and said, well, here are some witnesses of the event. Now, I'm not interested in talking about the truthfulness or falsity of the claims that are, but the thing is, the FBI could go out and talk to these witnesses at this point. Isn't it a bit different when we're dealing with the New Testament claims, because the witnesses are all dead right now?
Right. So basically, what you would have is historical witnesses that would be making their claims. And of course, you have a number of those for the resurrection. But then you would also try to look at claims being put forth by somebody in antiquity on the behalf of Richard Carrier. And so if somebody says that the resurrection of Jesus Christ came from preceding dying and rising pagan gods, then you should be able to see some sort of information that would point you to that direction as far as documents from historical witnesses that show the actual handoff between a pagan cult and, say, early Christians. And that's, I think, a major problem here, is that there are no historical witnesses that show some sort of handoff from pagan cults to the early Christian church. As a matter of fact, you see positive evidence showing that there was not any handoff. When you plumb the readings of the New Testament, it's obvious that the resurrection does not come from pagan dying and rising gods. It comes from Jewish theories and scriptures coming from the Old Testament.
Yeah, but the difference is that we can't directly talk to the witnesses in the case of the New Testament. We can't go and say, okay, Matthew, tell us about what you saw and such. So how do we go in and really examine the claim, since we can't question the witnesses?
Right, exactly. So then you would talk about chain of custody. That's another principle in the criminal justice field. Chain of custody, in other words, say if I had a gun on the street and I wanted to produce it in court, I would have to show that it's the same gun that I took off the street and that I'm producing in court when I use it as evidence against a defendant. So what I would do is I would inscribe the gun with my initials. I would put it in packaging with my initials all over it. I would hand it over to somebody, and that person would keep it for me. Then I would come and collect it back again. And then I would take this weapon in front of a judge. The same thing with the New Testament scriptures. We have a great chain of custody where we see the scriptures going from generation to generation to generation. And so we have a great chain of custody. We have information knowing that these authors were in fact who the early church says they were. I know that's one contention Carrier has. We don't know who the New Testament authors were, but everyone else in antiquity did, because we have a number of people writing about who the authors were from the second century on.
Yeah. When I'm hearing some of this, I'm reminded of what my friend J. Warner Wallace also says in his work, and that shouldn't be too surprising because it's the same field pretty much, isn't it?
Yeah, Jim Wallace, he really has a wonderful book, his Cold Case Christianity. It's a standard that everybody who's interested in these sorts of discussions should purchase. It's very good.
If anybody's interested, by the way, he has been on our show 3 times. Once Cold Case Christianity for Kids, and God's Crime Scene. So if you're interested in that, go back and listen to those interviews. We could say, where we have a whole stack of people who say Matthew wrote Matthew. I mean, all our sources I talk about, I think, do say Matthew wrote Matthew. We don't have any contrary theory, but to be fair, that doesn't mean they're all right, though, does it?
I mean, I don't know 100% that that's the case, but what I'm saying is that accepted principles of evidence would show us that Matthew is the author. Of course, you can't know anything with total and complete certitude from our perch here in the 21st century. However, the evidence that we have points to Matthew as the author, and the other gospel authors as well. So unless you have some sort of large amount of countervailing evidence, then a principle is that you should accept the evidence until it's contradicted in some. So I think we should be confident in who the traditional view of the Christian authors are.
I always like to say this when I'm in my debates with skeptics. As soon as they bring forward something and I'll give a counter to it and such, and they don't really say anything, or give back some sort of answer, say, look, you've presented an argument. I've given a defeater to your argument. Unless you can show my defeater is wrong or produce something different, then my argument stands until otherwise. And that is how it goes legally and such, isn't it?
That is how it goes. I mean, evidence should be accepted unless you can really convincingly impeach the historical witnesses. And that's another thing that I do in the book from a law enforcement accepted principles of evidence perspective. I show what you would need in order to impeach a historical witness.
Yeah, something we've also seen with these hearings going on, because I'm sure you've looked at Facebook some and seen it, is that people are often looking to say, well, she or he sure sounded credible, they sure sounded convincing, and it's too easy to let emotion then guide our principles and such. So what steps do we take to counter that kind of thing?
So if you're saying you're watching something on TV, I guess you would put the same principles into perspective. How much corroboration do you have? And you've heard that term bandied about a lot. For like one witness, does that person have a lot of evidence, people that have seen them together at the place, date, and time? And that's another thing. With the gospel authors, of course, you have it historically situated in the correct time frame. And you know that was a question in these hearings, was what was the exact time frame, what was the location, and plus, again, strengthening of evidence. These are things that I would actually want to see if I'm looking at something and trying to judge the credibility of something. Is there circumstantial evidence? Is there historical witnesses that can come forward and corroborate things? And of course, if there are witnesses, can you impeach them properly? And so these are the things that I would say, Nick.
Yeah, and by the way, for those out there listening, this interview was arranged well over a month ago. It's just happy circumstances that came about the same week as this whole thing is going on and such. But what I'm wondering, though, about Dr. Hickling is, how can we, when we're investigating the claims, avoid emotion and bias best? Because, I mean, let's face it, you and I, we're both Christians, and you went into your investigation being a Christian. Couldn't someone just say, well, of course that's where you came out and you're biased? And with these hearings going on, we're all prone to look and say, well, that testimony that person gave really, really touched me, or really, it gave us an emotional reaction, and we can too often say that equals truth. How can we avoid those kinds of things?
Yeah, honestly, Nick, I don't think that we can avoid it completely and totally, because we've had our subjective experiences. So Dr. Carrier might have subjective experiences that lead him to believe that that God does not exist, and that these points that are being brought about by Christians of that Jesus Christ died and arose from the dead. He might have a subjective reason also, in addition to his objective material that he's trying to bring forward. So I think it's hard to make a total and complete separation. But I think what an honest investigator needs to do, and this is one of the things that I said in the short forward of this book, was that we need to actually really seriously consider what he says, because the truth is if Jesus Christ did not arise from the dead, then what we're doing as Christians is all in vain. So it is an important question. But I think basically, when you apply these accepted principles of evidence, it helps you, it guides you. Okay, how much evidence real evidence do I actually have for my claim? Well, I've got X, Y, and Z. Well, if someone else has just maybe half of X or nothing at all, it's basically opinion and conjecture, then that would cause me to wonder if my view is really justified historically. Because again, we're talking about a historical question here, about a historical event, and therefore these evidentiary principles apply. So yeah, I would say applying these criteria would help against a total and complete subjective blitzkrieg.
And of course, that's one of the reasons why in New Testament scholarship there is such a thing as peer reviews, that you can let even your critics look at your work, and they might not agree with your case, but they'll say, you've at least provided some evidence for your case.
Exactly right.
Now, let's start looking into the material itself. I mean, the first part there is about the resurrection narratives, and it starts out with something that we all agree is pretty obvious. But when you look at the different narratives in the four Gospels, and we could include Paul's account in 1 Corinthians 15, some of this, there are differences. Now, differences, does that automatically equate to contradictions?
Right, exactly. I mean, the question that you ask is a good one. And I think when you look at the actual definition of contradiction, then you see that it's a very stark definition. Basically, if one set of information is contradicting another set of information, then there is going to be no overlap at all. It's sort of like if you have a Venn diagram of number sets and there's no intersection whatsoever, then that would be what would be considered a contradiction, where the information has no overlap at all whatsoever. But I think what we have in the gospel resurrection accounts and also Paul's account is you have an overlapping. You have definitely differences, but contradictory information, I'm not so sure about that. And also the fact is that when you have different witnesses that are testifying, it's not that a witness will contradict another witness, but a witness can contradict himself. So what you have here is you have four different witnesses talking about the same event. So basically, it's hard, with this to actually say that one witness is contradicting another one, unless they give contradictory testimony that is totally and completely different, sort of like the Venn diagram I just described.
Now, when I was watching the hearings this week, though, I remember Senator Blumenthal was saying false in one thing could lead to falsity in other things. So let's suppose we did find some sort of contradiction. We found that one of the gospel writers was wrong on something. Does that mean we should question then even more stringently everything he says, that he's automatically wrong in everything at that point?
Well, I mean, I might not actually say that he was wrong in what he said. He might say something as far as a resurrection that's totally, completely different, or that might be supplemental to what another gospel writer said. But yeah, if they're differing, then to me, as an investigator, that just means that they're coming from a totally and completely different perspective. For those who weren't present, for those authors who weren't present, they were probably talking to different witnesses. Different witnesses are going to see things a little differently and from their perspective. For instance, John does not mention all of the women witnesses to the resurrection, but he prominently references Mary, of course. And that's because Mary came to him. And so his whole introduction to the risen Jesus Christ comes from Mary. So why should John go into a long catalog of the women witnesses?
Yeah. I mean, I get that you don't think there's contradictions in account. Personally, I don't either, but at the same time, inerrancy isn't a hill I'm willing to die on. So if we did look at the account and we did find something that we were all agreed on was an error, does that mean we should question everything and think that there isn't any truth in these accounts?
Right. If say, for instance, if you're supposing that there was an error, which I'm not, like you said, you're not either, but if there was, then basically I think it actually aligns with what you see with witnesses that come into court. And that's one of the things that the federal pattern jury instructions advise jurors when they're handling the testimony of witnesses. They'll say, hey, 2 or 3 witnesses, they might be describing the same event, but they might not be describing things totally exactly the same. And you might have one that disagrees with one, but if you think that the witnesses are credible, if you have 3 or 4 witnesses that are credible and you believe that they're talking about the same event and about the same essential events, it's okay for you to rule that they were credible. And just because there might be something that you might think is an error with one witness doesn't mean to discredit that witness or the other witnesses.
Yeah, I think it's been said that, you could look at the resurrection accounts and maybe there are contradictions, hypothetically, in the minor secondary details, who all went to the tomb, what time of day it was, etc. but they all seem to be united on the major details. It was women who discovered the tomb, the stone was rolled away, the body wasn't in there, Jesus was risen, etc.
Yeah, right. I think John Wenham makes that point too, is that you have different witnesses because, say, Mark came from a different center, geographic center where he was talking to witnesses from his location, or Matthew came from another center, so he's talking with different witnesses. It does not mean that just because they have different witness lists, it doesn't mean that they're contradictory witness lists. It just means that they differ some. And really, the differences really aren't that great either.
Now, you keep saying witnesses over and over, and I'm sure there are some skeptics that could be dismissing. Yeah, witnesses. How can we be sure these are witnesses? I mean, many scholars place these a generation or more after the events. So how can we be sure these are witnesses?
Well, again, we talk about what the early church fathers have told us not very long after the closing of, say, the canon in the 2nd century. You have different publications that were put out that talk about the authorship of the Bible and who the people were. You have the early church writings that tell us also who the authors were, and not just one. So we have corroboration on the authorship coming from a number of different sources. So I think we can be confident that the authors that we have are in fact the ones that are purported by the Christian church. They're corroborated by accepted principles of evidence. I mean, we have documents and historical witnesses that are telling us who these authors were.
Yeah, and I find it interesting when we talk about the Gospels. Matthew, a tax collector. Mark, I like to refer to him as, to bring a point home, he was the mama's boy who split up between Paul and Barnabas and ran back home and later caused a division between these two first great missionaries of the church. And yet his name gets ascribed to Gospel. And they could have just as easily said Peter, since he was Mark's writer according to traditions. But nope, they went with Mark instead. And Luke, a Gentile, who is only mentioned in the epistles, and the only name of an author that you would really think would gather a whole lot of credibility in the time would be John. And ironically, John's the only one who's disputed to some extent in the church fathers. Is it John the Apostle or is it John the Elder?
Right, yeah, that is a technical question that people bandy about. But I think basically, if you look at all of the information, I think, the beloved disciple who was on the breast, or who leaned against the chest of Jesus Christ, Irenaeus talks about it. The disciple, and then of course that's where you have arguments, countervailing arguments, where they try to discredit Irenaeus. But I don't think discrediting him, the information they use, does a great job of impeaching him as a credible witness at all.
Yeah, I actually lean more towards Ben Witherington's idea that the Lazarus is a beloved disciple, but either way, we are still dealing with an eyewitness, aren't we?
Well, that's what they purport, actually. And if you look through all of the Gospels, what I thought was striking was the fact that they're always using technically juridical language or evidentiary language, like we are witnesses to these things. We testify of what we have seen. We testify of what we have heard. It's not just, Puff the magic dragon lived by the sea, and they're talking about some sort of mythical thing. They're talking with precisely technical language that leads me to believe that they were witnesses. Testimony, witnessing, etc.
And they also don't have language in them such as once upon a time, or it is said that long ago, or a long, long time ago in a galaxy far, far away.
Right, exactly right.
Yeah, the whole genre of the Gospels should be taken into consideration. I mean, I've argued with more than enough skeptics who try and compare the Gospels to, say, Harry Potter or comic books or such, and that's not really a valid way to treat the evidence, is it?
Right. So the author of Harry Potter, of course, of course, it's a very successful series, and she should be rewarded for her work with it because it's so popular. But she's not under threat of death. She's not publishing these things. So, of course, that's what we have with the New Testament authors. They are all mostly under threat of death. And so that's a great point for circumstantially proving that the New Testaments are valid, is that their authors knowingly were facing death because of what they believed and what they were spreading. So there's a big difference between, say, J.K. Rowland and, say, the disciple Peter. He wasn't one of the authors of, say, the Gospels, but he was an author of First and Second Peter. And he was, as you know, he was crucified. Tradition has it that he was crucified upside down in the 80s, 60s.
Well, I'd like to let people know a little bit of some that has been coming. We have been in communication some because another aspect in consideration is that the Gospels are Greco-Roman biographies. We have been in communication with Dr. Richard Burridge. The 25th anniversary of his book is going to come out, I believe, this year, and he is interested in coming on the show to talk about that book when it comes out. So if I was interested in that, just watch for the upcoming show whenever it comes out. Don't have a date yet, but watch for it. But
very interesting.
Yeah. Now, let's look at some of the contradictions. For instance, different accounts have different women going to the tomb. How do we reconcile that? I mean, can't the authors even just remember who was going there?
Right. Well, basically, we do have witness lists, and I'm not turned to it at this exact moment, but I think what you will find is that a number of the witnesses are matching very well, and there might be a difference in a witness that's added or a witness that's subtracted. And so that's not a big divergence. To say that they're contradictory lists, I think, is really stretching things, because if there is just one or two that are different, then how can those be contradictory? Those would be very easily overlapping. They're just different witness lists. Again, John Wenham's point is taken very well, that these men were most likely talking to different witnesses, some mostly the same, but some different. And so that's how they constructed their witness lists, because of who they actually spoke to.
I think there's a lot to it. I've had a theory ever since reading the first edition of Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, to which we have had Richard Bauckham on the show twice about that topic, if anyone's interested, that the women that are named in the accounts are the ones that the disciples spoke to about them, the ones who were alive, who were still eyewitnesses. So when you get to John's, which is usually thought to be the latest, only Mary Magdalene's still around. But yet Mary Magdalene, the account only mentions her, but when she talks about going to Peter and the beloved disciples, she says, we don't know where they've taken him, which means she wasn't alone.
Right, exactly. So just because John is concentrating on the one primary witness that was involved in what he was doing, that was crucial in his responding to the empty tomb, that's why he mentions Mary alone. But you're right, that's a very good point. We is the pronoun that Mary uses.
Another big one for a lot of people is, and we're going to talk more about the nature of the appearances later on, so I'm not interested in getting into whether they were hallucinations or such yet, but the Gospels seem to differ on where the appearances took place. Were they in Galilee? Were they in Jerusalem? Which one do we go with?
Well, right, because Luke has written, I think Luke in particular is one where they say, it's only in Jerusalem. But however, you have to look at his work as a whole. You have him talking about the resurrection in Jerusalem, but then you have to look at Acts, and of course that they encountered the risen Jesus Christ, also where he ascended as well, Nazareth, Galilee area. So you actually have the writings of Luke in both areas, and I don't think within Mark, of course, you just have you don't have if you accept the short ending of Mark, then you have basically an empty tomb with no risen Jesus Christ, even though it's in Jerusalem. But then he's saying, hey, he's going ahead before you into Galilee, etc. Go there, basically. So you have those two bases covered. And I think basically with Matthew and John, you have it, and you have sightings, etc., in both areas.
Yeah.
So I think that covers it. I think that's basically, people don't really look at Acts, as they forget about Acts. The fact that Luke says in his gospel that Jesus Christ is seen there, but he's also seen in Galilee as well, or on the mountain.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that even Bart Ehrman, I think in his book Jesus Before the Gospels, says that Mark still has a resurrection narrative, even though if you go with a short ending, there are no appearances. The resurrection still takes place in Mark.
Yes, it does. You're right. Yeah, even with the short ending, it does. And he does say that he's coming, you will see him, he's going to be seen by you again in another area.
Mm-hmm.
That's right.
Yeah, but if we were researching the case, should we be skeptical of the tradition if all we had was Mark, for instance? Is Mark sufficient to establish a resurrection?
I mean, I think it is. I think the tomb, there's no explanation. The women witnesses were in terror. You had the young man, obviously wasn't just dressed in white, wasn't just a regular guy. It was somebody that the women were fearful of. He also had knowledge that he shouldn't have as just a regular guy. I mean, he had prophetic knowledge about where Jesus would be in the future. He had obviously knowledge of what had happened before. I think it's very sound to say that we had a resurrection in Mark. Mm-hmm. Where are you on that, Nick?
I would agree we do have a resurrection in Mark. If we return still further, I mean, something else about these appearances is how many people saw him, because they seem to be so different. And we've got several people who say, well, geez, Mark is first, there are no appearances. Then in Matthew, you get some appearances. Then in Luke, you get appearances with him eating and speaking and doing more things. Then in John, Jesus is teleporting into locked rooms. So don't we see like an evolutionary progression going on?
Well, that's a theory that they bring. But I think what you have is something that's a supernatural occurrence. You've got something with an empty tomb. You've got angels. You have all of these glorious appearances, and you have different locations where he's visiting different people in 3 of the Gospels, anyways, if you accept the short ending. So you have all of these contacts that are physical, that are supernatural, and to say that there is a theological progression. I mean, it might be in some, when you're talking holistically about the Gospels, that John might be more into the logos, the Greek aspect of things, and bringing out the Word. Jesus is the Word of God. But as far as the resurrection accounts themselves, they're all supernatural. They're all glorious appearances, and they're all life-changing for the people that experience them as well.
Yeah, but there do seem to be some stark differences. I mean, Paul mentions 500, and that would seem to be a pretty powerful case to some people, but none of the gospel writers seem to think this appearance is worth mentioning.
Well, it might be that Paul has later observations as well, and has had more experience traveling around the diaspora and regions in Jerusalem where he has, from his later years of investigating things, run into all these people. And he says, hey, many of them are still alive today.
Mm-hmm. And so it could be, for all we know, that maybe Paul didn't think these were the best evidences either. I mean, maybe the 500 is just a nicer add-on. He's saying, yeah, there's 500, but I recommend you listen to the testimony of the apostles instead.
Well, I mean, yeah, there's any number of things you could attribute to Paul's, but I think Paul's statements. But I think it's talking about again getting back to principles of evidence, that these are heavily corroborated accounts, and that Paul himself did go and actually do extensive investigation on this, and he did interview a bunch of people, including Peter and James, which he actually mentions in his epistles.
Now, when we're listening to the Senate hearings investigating Kavanaugh, one of the things we've heard is, well, Ford doesn't even know when this event took place. Well, apparently the gospel writers don't know when it took place either, because they get the time of the day confused, don't they?
Well, I would like for you to actually expound on that.
Well, one of them says it was dark. One of them talks about the day breaking at the time and things like that.
Yeah, well, I think that's basically, now you're talking about probably from just personal experience when it's turning from dark to light. You're talking only about several minutes. You might be talking 15, 20 minutes. So I think of all of the points that come forth, like I think Carrier actually addresses that at some point. I think that's one of his weakest points, because it's so insignificant, the point that he's trying to make, because I think we all from our natural experiences encounter the sunrise, and you know that there's only a span of 10 or 15 minutes where it goes from dark to light.
Now, when you get to the point where you're starting to evaluate these claims, you do say, well, here are what some Christian scholars say. Now, I can picture there are some skeptics who could be just think, yes, Christian scholars. Go with the people who are biased and who will say anything to make their case because they have to have a resurrection.
Right. Well, so what I would do is I would point them to the proper way to impeach witnesses in the law enforcement criminal justice community, going to the Federal Rules of Evidence, Federal Rule of Evidence 610, which states that you cannot impeach a witness based on his religious perspective. It's just improper to do. What you have to do is you have to bring positive evidence that this witness is either lying or has lied in the past, is a cheat, is a thief, or stands to gain financially, say, in some way. And so that is the proper way to impeach a witness. But you cannot, in the Federal Rules of Evidence, you cannot say just because somebody is a Christian, you can impeach them on those grounds, because that's improper. I mean, think about it. It just makes sense, because isn't that basically bigotry? Like you could say that of Roman historians. Oh, they're all Roman. And so basically we can't trust their histories because they're biased. It just doesn't make sense. It's bigotry. And I think the Federal Rules of Evidence have it right with Rule 610.
But if we follow that argument consistently, we could never argue anything in a court of law, because any lawyer coming forward could be said to have a bias, because, they want to get paid for the work they're doing. And, so many lawyers say, hey, if we don't win the case, you don't get it, you don't spend a dime and such. Or they want to protect their reputation and keep looking good. They want that honor and such. Or some combination, or maybe something else entirely.
Right, exactly. I think everybody has some sort of implicit bias. But the question is somebody being dishonest when they testify? Yeah. And that's where I think there is no really impeachable evidence against the disciples or the authors, the gospel authors, because we don't know them as liars, cheats, or thieves. We don't have any writings. We don't have any other historical witnesses in their writings talking about, the total and complete dishonesty in particularity. Nobody brings forth evidence against the gospel authors.
And that's something important to bring forward, because we could say hypothetically that these people might have had things to gain, such as, say, eternal life and such in the future, but in the present time, they had persecution and such to gain, and we don't see anything about them gaining the things that J. Warner Wallace would say motivate any sort of crime or lie, power, sex, or money.
Right, exactly. And of course, again, pointing to the rules of evidence, to 607 and Federal Rule of Evidence 607 and 608, I think you should impeach a witness properly. Do you have any information that they're dishonest? Do you have any information that they're a cheat? And if you don't, then how are you going to impeach a witness?
And some that we see going on in these Kavanaugh hearings, and again, I'm not asking you to give a verdict on such, but one of the things that defenders of Kavanaugh keep saying is, yes, Kavanaugh has been alleged to do things. No one is disputing that. But the accusation isn't enough. In the same sense, we could accuse the gospel writers of many, many things, but the accusation itself isn't enough, right?
Right. You would need some sort of actual particularized information coming from a historical witness, I think, and we just don't have that to discredit the gospel authors.
And of course, some people could say that, well, no one would have cared to write about and such. Christianity was a small sect and such, but it doesn't help us to point to evidence we don't have for whatever reason.
Right, exactly. Well, and of course, yeah, exactly right. There's no information coming from antiquity. You do have some information coming from antiquity, of course, from Justin the martyr. That it was believed that the Romans thought the Christians were cannibals because of the love feast, etc., and that they were idolaters, etc. So these are the type of claims. We do have claims coming forth from antiquity, but we don't, such as these, but we don't have claims coming that they were cheats and thieves and liars.
In fact, we might say in some cases, we even have the exact opposite. If we look at what Pliny the Younger said about what the Christians did when they met regularly, we see the opposite of cheats and liars.
Right, and exactly. Yeah, good point, Nick. And also the fact you look at Peter, one of the head characters of the church, and he's constantly being shown to be flawed and being someone who's very weak at points. But this was a sanitized version of the accounts of those days. They surely would have made him look like he was some sort of hero of some sort. I mean, in the sense that he never committed a wrong and that he was just totally above reproach. But that's why I love the Gospels as well, because I can associate with Peter because I'm flawed just as much as he is. So it rings true.
Now, something that Carrier has said, I believe, about the criterion of embarrassment is that it really is too subjective. And such because, hey, what's embarrassing for one culture and one group might not be embarrassing to another. So maybe when we talk about the disciples aren't presented in the best light, that might not work so well because maybe it just wouldn't have been as bad to them.
Well, it's not necessarily exactly the criteria of embarrassment that I'm thinking of in the sense. I'm just thinking that they're not trying to glorify him. They're not trying to put him forth, like, say, as this totally and completely pure being that is above reproach. They're just calling it as it is.
Now, I'd like to also ask about something else here. I'm going to tell people about your book at the end, and I do encourage them to buy it, but you also are talking a lot about the rules of evidence. If people just want to see the rules of evidence, is there a place online where they can go and find these?
Principles of evidence, yeah. There's I cited a lot in my bibliography. I'm trying to turn to it now, but it's it's one of the sites where you just go and get the federal rules of evidence. But for the federal pattern jury instructions, you just need to look up, say, the Sixth Circuit Court federal pattern jury instructions, and they will differ from circuit court to circuit court. But you can find those online just by doing a federal circuit court, Sixth Circuit, federal pattern jury instructions. And I'm trying to turn to the other resource that I don't have memorized, Cornell University Law School Legal Information Institute. That's where you can find all the various federal rules of evidence that I cite in my book, the Cornell University Law School Legal Information Institute.
Now let's move on to the next part of your book here. About maybe 15 or so years ago, probably a little bit later, maybe 12 or 13 of them back, because I remember I was living with a roommate in Charlotte at the time when it was becoming very popular. There was this film that came out on the internet called Zeitgeist. I'm guessing you know about it, right?
Yeah, I've heard about it.
Yeah,
definitely.
and it was largely conspiracy theory things, and the second part was trying to argue that the World Trade Center bombing was an inside job and such. But the first part was about religion. And you know, we think Jesus is so incredible, but geez, all these other figures, they were born on December 25th. They were born of a virgin. They had 12 disciples. They did miracles. They were said to be titles like the Good Shepherd, the Bread of Life, etc. They were baptized at the age of 30. They were crucified. They were said to have risen again. Such all these countless figures. And yet, here we only look at Jesus. And, you know, if you're not informed on a matter, that does look like a pretty convincing case, doesn't it?
Right, yeah. So I think that's what a lot of these internet bloggers anticipate, that you're not actually going to go to a library and sit down and read books, which is exactly what I did. So yeah, you have these people just putting out all of these claims about these pagan gods that are allegedly lined up to, the New Testament, Jesus Christ. But if you do any sort of studying, I know Mithras was a very popular one years ago, and I don't think any scholar really seriously considers that Mithras, the Roman god, is actually some sort of prototype of Jesus Christ, because I think scholarly research pretty much buried that one. I don't think Richard Carrier asserts that either. I think basically what we found out was that it actually came after Christianity, and a lot of our knowledge that we have from early church scholars writing about Mithras. So, I mean, I think that's an example of what you just referenced, Nick, that people will just put all sorts of stuff on the internet, and then they anticipate that people won't follow up and actually read and do research. But yeah, Mithras is a perfect example. That's basically that's been discredited years ago.
Yeah, and even if some scholars give some credibility to some things, it's usually in minor secondary details, and those ones that come up later, such as some scholars might think Jesus being born on December 25th was influenced by Mithras, but that's something that's nowhere said in Scripture.
Right. I don't think anybody really knows exactly what date Jesus Christ was born on.
Mm-hmm. So, before we start looking at the specific examples, you said go to a library and read books. Where if people want to go and read books at the library on these figures, what are some guidelines they should follow?
Well, basically, I think you need to make sure that the person that's doing the writing is a scholar that's noted in his field, doing work, historical, mythological work on these different characters. So, in essence, if somebody is a well-known scholar and is published from a well-known publishing house, and he's a accomplished in his field, then I think that's somebody that you should read, and kind of that's sort of what I did with this chapter 3. With that the resurrection of Jesus was influenced by pagan myths. I went in and dug into the scholarship that was secular scholarship about what they said about the different gods that Carrier provided in his work, and that's where I did a lot of my work. Was just sitting in the library, reading the research of these scholars.
And, of course, not only the scholars, but one of the other great sources to go to is any primary sources you can close to the time, such as the ancient histories, or, for instance, if we were talking about Horus and Osiris, you might want to read things like, say, the Egyptian Book of the Dead, for instance.
Well, right, of course, I can't read that because I'm not well-versed in Egyptian, or cuneiform, or whatever the hieroglyphics, or whatever the god we're talking about in these ancient languages. So I have to rely upon what scholars say. These these works say. Like, in other words, the ancient Egyptian walls were covered with references to Osiris. I don't know how to read hieroglyphics to rely on a scholar to give me that.
Well, I'd like to remind everyone at this point, you're listening to the Deeper Waters podcast. My guest is Dr. Ross Hickling. We're talking about his book on the resurrection, looking at the work of Richard Carrier. But if you're here next week is going to be the first Saturday in October, and I really wanted to dedicate this October to the Reformation. So you are going to have a lot of shows on Reformation. We've got 3 of them planned out already, working on the 4th. But one next week, we're going to have Dr. Jim Payton on, writing books such as Light from the Christian East, an introduction to the Orthodox tradition. He's not Orthodox, but he's done a lot of research on the position and such. And he's going to be in dialogue with Barnabas Powell here at the local Orthodox church that my wife and I visit from time to time. They're going to be talking about Protestant and Orthodox relationships here. We're going to learn something about Eastern Orthodoxy. We're going to learn something about Protestantism, and we might understand what the other side thinks better. We might understand our own side a little bit better. I mean, I would say in this research, I've come to see different things about the Catholic and Orthodox traditions myself, but I've actually come now to appreciate even more my own Protestant tradition and why I hold it. So if you're wondering why you're in the position you are and what these other sides think, I hope you'll be here next month and that you'll be here next week. For now, let's get back to Dr. Hickling talking about his work on Richard Carrier. Well, let's start with one that you mentioned, Horus and Osiris. And usually the story is pretty much the same, that Horus was indeed born of a virgin, that he was the good shepherd. He was born on December 25th. He had 12 disciples. Sometimes they'll say he was baptized by someone, and that he told a story that parallels the rich man Lazarus. He died, he rose again, and it's often tied in with Osiris as well. Usually these two are combined in some sense. So okay. Let's talk about one of these figures here. The Horus figure, who's often combined with Osiris, as it were.
He is.
And he's usually thought to be born on December 25th, born of a virgin, did miracles, had 12 disciples, was given titles like the Good Shepherd and such. I think some people say he was baptized at the age of 30, and he supposedly told he raised Lazarus from the dead, or told a parable about a Lazarus figure and such, that he was crucified and that he rose again. Such. Now, what's the lowdown on this figure? What really happened with him?
Well, right. So with Osiris, I basically focused on Osiris, but as you alluded to, a lot of times they're combined. You know, the living Horus is the netherworld Osiris, so they are combined a lot. So I basically focused on Osiris himself. And what I realized quickly, but first, before I go into the contrasts and comparisons between Osiris and Jesus Christ, I would like to say that in researching this topic, what I realized is that there's a logical fallacy that is being relied upon when you even make these sorts of comparisons without particularized information, because that is actually the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy. Just because something precedes something in history doesn't mean that it's causally connected. And that's the major point that Carrier's trying to make without particularized evidence, is that because something preceded something else, then the thing that happened afterward, the occurrence that happened afterward necessarily follows from the preceding incident. And so that's what we have here. We have a post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy being employed, because that's basically his main point that he's trying to make, that there are similarities and that one came before the other. But really the important point is to provide a historical witness or witnesses good, high quality evidence that there was a pass down, that there was a pass off between a pagan cult and a Christian cult. And if you had this in writings, if you had historical witnesses telling us of the same, then he would actually have evidence, particularized, relevant evidence to undergird what he's trying to say. But he doesn't have any of this. He just says, oh, because these dying and rising gods preceded Jesus Christ, therefore the resurrection comes from these dying and rising gods. I'm sorry, that just doesn't cut the mustard. Evidentially. And so I wanted to say that first. That's the first glaring problem that Richard Carrier has with his thesis in this regard. And now we can go and talk in reference to these characters, if you wanted to.
Because Jews and Christians both were very cautious about outside influences and such on even the most minute of details as well.
Yeah, exactly right. So you make a good point, Nick. We actually have positive evidence to the contrary. We have positive evidence that every time in Jewish history that there was some sort of intermingling, it was expressly forbidden in any number of situations, and I catalog that too. I also actually go into the New Testament and talk about the prohibition of mixing at all with any sort of idols, coming from Paul's work. So if you have in the Old Testament a total exclusivity with God and no other gods, and if you have the same in the New Testament with Jesus Christ or God, then how can somebody without any really good evidence make this claim? But we have evidence to the contrary, that there was no mixing. So I think that's an important point that you made, Nick.
And going back to the post hoc fallacy and such, I mean, we know Mike Lacona has talked about this story of this big ship that's said to be unsinkable, sailing the Atlantic in the month of April. All of a sudden, it hits an iceberg, it starts to sink, and there aren't enough lifeboats for everyone. And we say, oh, you're talking about Titanic. No, I'm talking about the Titan in the book Futurity, because it's the same scenario, and that took place before the Titanic sank.
Right. Good example.
So let's talk some about Horus Osiris. I mean, who was he really?
Okay, yeah, basically Osiris was an ancient Egyptian god, and he was born with his sister Isis. They're together in the womb, and this is where mythology it quickly you know the differences between the accounts of Jesus Christ in the New Testament and then the ancient Osirian accounts, because Isis and Osiris actually had sex in the womb, and so that's how they came together. And then he became the ruler of Egypt. And basically what happened is he accidentally had, I guess it was dark, and he accidentally had sex with Seth, his brother, his wife. And then at that point, that's when everything goes sour for Osiris as king. There's a feast that Seth holds for him. And so he's already conspired with 72 people that are his co-conspirators. They're going to have a casket that's at this party, and then what Seth is going to do is he's going to have a contest to see who fits the casket. So along the way, Osiris says, hey, I'll jump in here and test this casket. And then when that happens, the co-conspirators come together. They nail the coffin shut with Osiris's body in it, and they float it down the river, the Nile, and then he's dead at this point because he's drowned in the Nile. And then supernaturally Isis comes around and finds the body, but then he's going around trying to help him. Then I guess Seth's minions seize the body of Osiris and cut it to pieces. And so with help of the gods, Isis somehow brings the body back together, and then magically copulates with Osiris, and Horus is born. And then after this, what happens is there's things happening, and it's very complex. Things are happening in the netherworld. They're making their case for Osiris. He shouldn't be dead. He should be allowed to come to the netherworld. And so the people in the gods in the netherworld have a vote and say, okay, we're gonna judge on behalf of Osiris, and you're going to come to the netherworld, and this is where you're going to be the king of the netherworld. So that's basically the story of Osiris in a nutshell. So basically what we have is somebody who was drowned, and somebody who was magically, he wasn't even reinstated to life, but he was transferred to the netherworld as king of the netherworld. And then in that world, basically he along with Ra, the sun god, then he sort of enlivens those who are able to get to the netherworld with their mummies upon death. So it takes a long time. So I'm going to pause here and have some more discussion. What do you want to discuss in reference to this, Nick?
Well, it's obvious. That's just exactly like the Christian story, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. There's not really a whole lot of similarities at all. And one of the things that I wanted to point out, I spent a lot of ink on this in my chapter on the dying and rising gods, is that with the Osirian formulation, as far as soteriology is concerned, or how you gain acceptance before Osiris and have a relationship with him, well, there really is no such thing with Osiris. There is no way that you gain salvation, well, with Osiris doing something for you and then having a praying relationship. It's basically a funerary cult, and the only way that you get to the netherworld successfully is that you have to do just one more act, good act, than you have bad acts. And not only that, you have to have the right magic scripts in your mummy container, in your coffin. That's how you gain acceptance before Osiris. There's nobody that's baptized into the religion of Osiris, as Carrier states. If you read the literature, basically it's merely a funerary cult where it's just based upon your deeds. And in total juxtaposition, you have Jesus Christ, who actually paves the way. We have a relationship. We have him dying for our sins, and we are cleansed by him. There's no such thing in the Osirian cult.
Yeah, in preparation for this Reformation Month, I have been doing some reading on Mary, and something that was striking me about this is how tame the accounts are. I mean, when you read Luke's account of, say, the virgin birth, which I do affirm, that you have saying, well, the Holy Spirit will overshadow you. It's not as if you have the account say, the Holy Spirit will overshadow you, and then we have a Kama Sutra being described and such, which is pretty much what I think we see in these pagan religions, isn't it?
Well, right. I think with the Romulan legend, you have the Vestal Virgin. Mars, in one account, comes and copulates with her. In another account, a magic phallus appears, and it's actual, physical sex act that's involved. So yes, it's absolutely right what you're saying. Or either that, or gods are cosmically having sex up in the, up in the stratosphere somewhere. Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And something else about the Horus Osiris accounts is that these aren't ever really, I think, meant to be seen as historical accounts. They don't take place at one specific time, such as so-and-so BC and such. And they are usually more built around the cycle of the Nile, right?
Yeah, exactly right. I don't think anybody really holds that Osiris was an actual person. I think it's obvious the way it's presented that it is a myth, which stands in total contradistinction to what the New Testament portrays about Jesus Christ.
Well, you talked about Romulus some, so let's look at him, because there could be some speculation that maybe he really is a historical figure. I mean, Plutarch even has a life of Romulus and such. So,
right.
So what's the story of Romulus then? I mean, he could be a historical figure.
He's legend, and he goes way back, to the very days before, the founding of Rome. I think 700-800 BC is what I'm hearing, or maybe even further back for what I read. And so basically what you have is somebody who is allegedly, along with his brother Remus, are the founders of Rome. And basically they have a legendary beginning where they're actually raised, suckled by a wolf. And then there is somebody who is the wife of a hunter who takes them in and actually helps raise them. And there are other supernatural things about their accounts that occur. But basically, at some point, they get old enough to become who they are. And so they start, in their adult era, they start founding the city of Rome. And at some point, it's apparent that there's all sorts of different versions of this, by the way. One of the versions is that Romulus starts actually building his wall, the outside fortifications of Rome, and then Remus, mocking him, jumps over the wall under construction, and then one of Romulus's men actually hits him with a shovel and kills him. But there's other things, other versions of that as well that happen, and some have Remus as continuing on. But so you have 3 or 4 variant accounts that are like totally and completely different. But basically, what happens with Romulus is that he ends up becoming the sole, or the mighty general there, and then he ends up becoming a very successful general with all of his military might and power that he eventually gets from building Rome into a powerful city. And then, of course, you have the rape of the Sabines, basically, that he formulates because his soldiers need women to be wives, and so they can have families and to continue the propagation of the Roman Empire. So he lures these women from his neighbors, the Sabaeans, into a festival, and then all of his soldiers swoop and carry off these women, according to Roman legend. So basically, what you have is a man, or a legendary figure, who has these supernatural roots with being suckled by a wolf, and then also him and Romulus and Remus, they have, when they're trying to, who's going to be in charge of what area and who's going to be the dominant one, they have these birds, they have these different unusual tests that they use. And then you have Romulus consolidating power. He's a general who's savage and ruthless in how he conquests other lands. And of course, already we're seeing the contrast with Jesus Christ.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but we also have accounts, don't we, that Romulus was seen alive again after his death?
Right, yeah, I didn't want to talk too much at one time, so I'm happy that you interject. But yes, basically what you have is he consolidates power, and you have different stories of how he died. One story is that it was a powerful storm, and then a cloud came and he was no longer. And one of the most popular ones was that he was actually brought into the Roman Senate chambers and he was murdered, and the chopped up portions of his body were transported out of the Roman chambers, and he disappeared that way. But yeah, you have a Julius Proculus, who one person who stated that he saw an epiphany of Romulus as he was walking after his disappearance. And basically he says, I'm now the god Quirinius, and that Rome shall be a great republic, keep on conquering, basically is what he said. And so that's basically the Romulan epiphany that we have coming from this legend.
And it's important that the epiphany doesn't equal resurrection.
Right, exactly. And so when we're applying these accepted principles of evidence, what we don't have is we don't have corroboration We don't have a chain of custody because we really don't know whether these events are even true or not. We don't have basically circumstantial evidence here. You just have one witness that witnesses an epiphany. He doesn't even know whether it's a body or not. So I think we can see a number of contrasts between Jesus Christ and Romulus, who was a savage, a ruthless general who, by violence, made conquest all over the area of where he was, according to the legend. In total contradistinction, you have with Jesus Christ, somebody who lived totally and completely for others and was not engaged at all. He was totally selfless. He didn't have the trappings of power. He didn't have any place to lay his head. He didn't have riches. A matter of fact, he eschewed riches totally. And in his resurrection, you have somebody who was knowingly giving up his life on behalf of others, where in contrast you have Romulus. His life was taken from him because they thought he was getting too powerful. The Roman Senate did. And then, of course, you have the bodily resurrection with all of the corroborated witnesses, which is rich in evidentiary character, as opposed to Romulus, who we just have one alleged witness who saw an epiphany.
I'd like to remind everyone at this point that you're listening to the Deeper Waters podcast, and everything we do here is supported by listeners like you. So I urge you to please go to our website at deeperwatersapologetics.com. There's a link on the side to help support the work of Deeper Waters Christian Ministries. And if you click that link, you get taken to the ministry of Risen Jesus. You've gone to the right place. Nothing's wrong with your computer. Nothing's wrong with my website. Mike and Debbie Lacona are my in-laws. And you make your donation. And then you get in touch with me or my wife Allie or Mike or Debbie and say, hey, I made my donation. I want to go to Nick Peters. I want to go to Deeper Waters. They will get that donation. It will be tax deductible. You can also buy ebooks that I have written, such as A Creed for the Ages, The Apostles' Creed in Today's Christian, or co-written God and Natural Disasters, Defining Inerrancy, and even the Mentionables Project. That's a rather fun one that I took part in. And also, tell me, Dr. Hickling, your wife, does she like jewelry?
Does my wife like
Yep.
jewelry? Yeah, she can't wear as much because of certain limitations, but yeah, she's always enjoyed jewelry. Do you have an inside track on that, Nick?
Actually, I do. I'm glad, but she mentioned it. My wife has the same thing. She's got an allergy to nickel, so she can't wear that much. But we have a jewelry store. Our friend Lena Clester does it with Premier Jewelers, and whatever you purchase there, 25% of it goes to Deeper Waters. So you just get in touch with me and let me know. So if you buy a piece of jewelry for, say, $100, we get $25. And like I say, guys, you can buy something special for that lady in your life to make up for that screw-up that you recently did with her. Or you can buy something special for that lady in your life to make up for that screw-up that I know you're going to make with her. And if you can't do any of these things, just do simple things. Share the podcast on your Facebook feed, talk about it, and go on iTunes and leave a positive review. I really love to see them. Dr. Hickling, do you have an organization you'd like people to donate to?
Well, I'm a member of two organizations. One is a small ministry that I run. It's called Shield Your Faith. And a shield is an allusion to a badge, which is also called a shield. So it's an allusion to evidentiary principles actually that support the risen Jesus Christ. So yeah, basically that's what I do. I use principles of evidence show the reasonableness of Christianity, and you can go there to shieldyourfaith.org, and I have my blog where I write different blog posts on contemporary issues that I think are of interest to people. And I also, if you want to reach me, you can reach me at ross@shieldyourfaith.org. And also Ratio Christi. if you go to the ratiochristi.org site, I think it's a great ministry that is spreading across the country. I'm involved in that in the Greensboro area, so I would encourage everybody to visit those sites, Nick.
Mm-hmm. Now, we're going to go really quickly through the last two figures that you cover. One of them is another one who could also be a historical figure, and that's Zalmoxis. In his case, it's quite different. Apparently, he was a rich person in, I believe, the area of Thrace, and he disappeared for a few years, and then he was seen again.
Right. Well, basically, this is another legend. We're not sure if he ever existed, and again, we don't have a good chain of custody as far as the historical witnesses with Zalmoxis. We've got Herodotus, the famous historian, who goes back and says he's heard some things from some other people about this man by the name of Zalmoxis, and he could have been the servant of Pythagoras, and that he was somebody, like you said, who kind of went from humble beginnings to being a prominent person among the Thracians. And basically, he would hold meals and he would talk about how to gain favor in front of God. And basically, that was by being a warrior or being a prominent citizen of good character. And so, yeah, like you said, Nick, I think where the alleged or supposed similarities comes in is that he disappeared, allegedly, according to this legend that we've heard from Herodotus. And basically, he didn't die and arise from the dead after 3 days. Basically, what we have with Zalmoxis is that Herodotus tells us that he actually deceived the Thracians and that he lived out of view of the Thracian citizens for a period of 3 years. And then he comes back. I guess he was secreted in an underground chamber. And then after 3 years, he comes back emaciated looking. And apparently relatives and some certain friends had contact with Zalmoxis, to give him status reports of what's going on in the world and maybe to bring him some food, etc. And then he comes back and says, I've been to the netherworld and I've seen these things and I am this, conduit, this supernatural character. So I think we can already see some pretty prominent differences. Of course, we talked about post hoc ergo propter hoc. That's the foundation of why we shouldn't receive these theories from Carrier. But now we see with every one of his candidates, and he's got a number of them. I just look at 4 of them, but he's got a number of different candidates that he looks at. So Zalmoxis is one of the ones he mentions a lot. But you already see, in spite of this logical fallacy that he relies upon, that he doesn't really have there's not really a lot of similarities between Zalmoxis and Jesus Christ.
Mm-hmm. And let's briefly go over Inanna.
In addition, part of the Zalmoxian cult was to every 5 years send somebody after he died and became a god, was to send someone to Zalmoxis to communicate to him. So every 5 years, they would have somebody that they would, in essence, sacrifice. So you had actual human sacrifice. They'd have a bunch of arrows arrayed, and then they would toss the whoever was the lucky messenger to visit Zalmoxis. Then they would toss him into this area of arrows, and if he survived, then he was okay. But if he died, then he went to Zalmoxis as a conduit. So then you have that aspect of it, and you also have the fact that this Zalmoxian cult was a sort of a subterranean sort of cult where the holy man would actually dwell in caves and grottos, and then he would communicate with the whoever the king or the ruler was of that area. So you have this sort of cult of the subterranean cult with this person who has these special powers from Zalmoxis, but what you don't have is you don't have really other than being a prominent citizen, a good upstanding citizen, and a good warrior, you don't have any way to actually sort of, in reference to Christianity, you of course you have the passion of Jesus Christ, and you have him dying for our sins. Other than what I just described, there's no other way to have any sort of acceptance with Zalmoxis. So I think you can see you have all of these contrasts with Zalmoxis as opposed to comparisons with Jesus Christ. I mean, he used deception. It was all about pretty much inviting the prominent citizens, the men of Thrace, to these fellowship meals. And what you don't have is you don't have somebody who is, again, like Jesus Christ, who sacrifices all and gives up everything. You have somebody who is deceiving. You have somebody who's interested more in politics. And you can see the total contrast between Zalmoxis and Jesus Christ.
Yeah, we're leave Inanavan for the books due to time restraints and such. Let's move to the last part. That is where we talk about the nature of the appearances. Because if you do any sort of dialogue with people on the internet or anywhere else, and they agree that, as most scholars agree, the disciples were sure they had seen the risen Jesus again, that they had some sort of appearances, the very next thing you hear is hallucinations. Now, Carrier does go a bit into detail about what could have caused these hallucinations, such as some state or condition where you're going in and out of sleep. And I know in his book on the historicity of Jesus, he suggested something like schizophrenia and such. So, why aren't these kinds of theories valid theories?
Right. Thanks, Nick. So what I did again is I went to the library, did a bunch of research, and actually pulled the research of psychologists and those who are experts in hallucinations, and I just went through all of the different hallucinations and actually studied what they were, especially the ones that Carrier offered. He offered that the disciples had hypnagogic or hypnopompic hallucinations, basically hallucinations where you're going in and out of sleep. Say you're going into sleep, you might see some strange abstract objects or odd faces that you're not familiar with. And again, with hypnopompic, coming out of sleep, you might see some really bizarre scenes and things that scare you. And so these are the sorts of hallucinations that he said could have been. Well,
let me step in for a little bit here right quick, Finn, because, I mean, we've heard of these kinds of things happening. There are cases of people in the Navy SEALs, I think it's going through Hell Week, as it were. They are denied sleep for a time, and they do start hallucinating. And, hey, the disciples, they just seen Jesus die. They'd had a pretty sleepless night, the night of the crucifixion, because, they're going to pray, and they can't even stay awake for an hour and such, and maybe they were on the run, maybe they were scared, maybe they just couldn't sleep, and so maybe Carrier does have a case, and maybe the disciples were just sleepless.
Well, right, that's actually different than hypnagogia and hypnopompic. That would be a sleep-deprived hallucination. That's another category of hallucination. And with that one, with these SEALs and with the other sorts of deprivation hallucinations, what you see is that they realize that once they get the right amount of sleep or once they recover, they automatically realize that what they had were hallucinations. Getting back to the going in and going out of sleep hallucinations, they're very brief, very abstract. It's not as if you had a whole scene that had any meaning to it with hypnagogic and hypnopompic hallucinations. So that couldn't be it. If you look really closely into the psychological hallucination literature, you realize it has nothing at all to any similarity with the resurrection account appearances. And so you did also mention schizophrenia hallucinations. Well, we could take a long time with that one, and we don't have a whole lot of time. But what I would say is that the schizophrenic hallucinations, these are the only type of hallucinations that people actually think are real. And however, if you look at the types of hallucinations that are under schizophrenia, you realize that the most prominent one is an auditory hallucination. And so having a visual and an auditory hallucination match up for a schizophrenia patient is something that normally doesn't happen. You might have a separate auditory hallucination, but then you would also have a totally and completely different visual hallucination. So what you find out once you do a scholastic study of schizophrenia type hallucinations, you realize that it could not be a schizophrenic hallucination. Yeah, go ahead, Nick.
Yeah, I was going to say, by everything, my wife actually does sometimes have these schizophrenic hallucinations, so I do know what you're talking about there.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks for mentioning that. There's other hallucinations that he talks about, bereavement hallucinations. Mm-hmm. Basically, people who lose their loved ones, they might have an encounter with some sort of brief reminiscence or something that reminds them of their loved one. But I mean, I go into great detail in the book on all these different sorts of hallucinations. I sort of catalog what the actual scholars are saying about these hallucinations. But just real quickly to say that a bereavement hallucination could not be what the disciples experienced, because these bereavement hallucinations actually are very short. They're very tiny reminiscences. They're not something where you thought your Uncle John is alive and is still alive today. Basically, people know that it's not real what they see. And again, the schizophrenic hallucination is the only one people think are real. And so that gets to the point: could 12 schizophrenic patients start a worldwide religion, have enough organization and ability to start one? Well, I've had schizophrenic patients in my family, and I know that they need to be cared for. And there's no way that 12 schizophrenic patients could start a worldwide faith like the Christian faith.
Yeah, and is there any reason, even aside from these experiences, to think these people were schizophrenic?
Yeah, right, exactly. I mean, I think we have a lot of the writings of the New Testament, even, of course, the authors, we know that a number of them were learned men, some of them are fishermen. There's no evidence, like you say, that actually points to the fact that any of them were schizophrenics. And here's something else that we know from literature, that a hallucination is a personal experience. So if 12 people were hallucinating at the same time, that would in and of itself be fantastic. But what we also know was that each of these hallucinators would be having their own personal hallucination.
We could also talk about Paul some here, because you'll find any number of things about him. Maybe he had epilepsy, or my personal favorite, he had a guilty conscience. Right, and I'm glad you bring that up, because in my research on hallucinations, I know that some people have had guilt as a result of, say, a hallucination, maybe of someone dying or some other terrible thing happening. But what I found, and I was looking for it in particular because I heard, I saw where Carrie was writing it, that perhaps it was guilt, where someone could have a hallucination. But nowhere in the literature, nowhere in the scholastic literature did I see where actually guilt was a cause of a hallucination. So, I think that the fact that you bring that up is good, because I don't think that's anywhere in the scholastic literature about guilt. Well, could Paul have been epileptic?
Right. Of course, with that, I have a whole section on that, and we could spend a whole lot of time on that as well, because I do poll what the scholars say on epileptic seizures. But I think basically when you go into that, what you would realize that what Paul had could not have been an epileptic seizure, because, again, at some point people do know that with an epileptic seizure, that it's what they might have as a hallucination is not real. And I do know someone who has epilepsy, and they know that anytime they have some sort of experience, they know it's not real. It's part of their seizure. And so what you have with Paul, though, is you have actual people. Again, we're talking about evidence. You have people that heard the voice or saw the light. You have people that actually led Paul to Damascus because he was temporarily blinded. You have the description of scales falling from his eyes. So you have indications that this was an actual event that occurred, because you have evidence of other people being present when it happened. Plus, you have physical manifestations, scales upon his eyes. You have blindness. So yeah, as far as it is concerned, I don't think that an epileptic seizure could have, or a hallucination from a seizure, could have been the cause of it. And again, I go into great detail on each one of these topics. So I'd encourage you, if you are interested, to see what the scholars are saying in each form of these hallucinations. I would encourage you to get this book and give it a read.
Yeah, and like I said, we're going to be telling people at the end of the show how they can get the book on Amazon and such. But I'd like to say something also about the whole thing about the guilt idea, is that we assume when we say that Paul's culture was much like ours, which is what's known as a guilt-innocence culture, and really, it wasn't. I mean, we have such a huge focus on guilt here in the West and such in America, but if you go and look at the Bible, it said, when it talks about guilt, it doesn't usually mean a feeling of guilt or something like that. It doesn't mean in turn, it means real, legal, judicial guilt, that you would be guilty of something objectively, regardless of how you felt. They were more concerned about your honor and your shame, and for Paul would have been growing in honor and reputation as a result of what he was doing.
Yeah. Well, good. Yeah, it's a very good point. I know that I'd heard you discuss that in the past, and I think that's relevant. I didn't actually explore that aspect of things, but I like what you're saying in that regard.
Yeah. And I think we should also keep in mind that when you have things like bereavement hallucinations and such, that it'd be extremely rare for someone to have a bereavement hallucination and then go and say, dig up the casket, they're alive, I know they're alive, they want my help.
Yeah, exactly right. I think that you would go from having a bereavement hallucination to a schizophrenic hallucination, because if you thought that he was alive again, you would be going into schizophrenia at that point. And again, these bereavement hallucinations were just very slight experiences. Like, for instance, one example that one of the scholars gave was of someone who had lost his father, and then they see in a race, they see someone that goes past their position where they're at observing a race, and it's like, well, that's my dad that just ran by. But then they go and see the guy again, and they realize, oh, that wasn't my dad. It was just, I thought for a second it looked like my dad. Mm-hmm. Or similar situations. So yeah, these bereavement quote hallucinations end of quote are just basically just very short experiences that they might have here and there as they progress through life after they've lost a loved one. And a lot of the professional literature was even starting to say that because there are so many of these experiences, that maybe there's something to it, and that it might not be a hallucination at all. And this isn't Christian literature now.
Yeah. And we could also say that what N.T. Wright would say in the ancient world, that if you saw someone like that after they had died, it wouldn't convince you that they were alive. In fact, it would convince you of the opposite. It would definitely convince you that that person was dead.
Right. You know what, Nick? You're right. And I think I actually quoted N.T. Wright with that. And so that's sort of the format of this book as well, is that what I do is I put Carrier's information in there as it is, and then I dig up the scholarly information on each subject, dying and rising gods. I look at the experts and what they say about these mythical characters, and then I look at the scholarly information on hallucinations, and I do a survey of that. And then what I'll do is I'll have cross-examining information saying, okay, Carrier, well, this is what these authors say in opposition to what you're saying. And then what I'll do is I'll follow that up, the scholarly information, with actual accepted principles of evidence, and then I apply it in each case to show whether Carrier whether his arguments actually align with these accepted principles of evidence. So yeah, that's sort of the way that I laid the book out.
And if Carrier has written something that you think does count as a counter reply, you put that also and then a further reply to it, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. So yeah, so say Carrier makes a claim, scholarly literature, and then I'll do a cross-examination with other scholars. And then if Carrier has ever rebutted it, I'll put Carrier's rebutting of it. And then if another scholar has rebutted what Carrier says, then I'll put what he says. So you have this back and forth going between scholars and also the evidentiary principles that I've mentioned.
Well, let's talk about one more thing on the appearances at least, and this is one of my favorite ones to see as well, the whole cognitive dissonance idea.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and develop that a little bit.
The whole thing is that, when people have these experiences where they have an event that goes against what they want to be true, they suddenly change the story, as it were, in order to save face, to not be embarrassed and such, and change the narrative in order to keep the movement alive. It's a way of dealing with a reality they don't want to accept.
Okay, well, that's interesting because I think what you would have to look at from an evidentiary perspective is how would that actually flesh out? How would that work out in the real world? Would people maybe hold this sort of belief, but then once threatened with death, wouldn't they give it up? For instance, I think of the Watergate burglars and the whole Nixon cover-up, and you have people that started turning state's evidence once pressure was put on them. So basically you have people starting to jump ship from the Nixon administration and because they see that pressure is mounting on them, and then they all start becoming witnesses of the prosecution in order to save their own skins. So if you had somebody that was trying to save face, I think when it came time to say either worship Caesar or die, or they would definitely recant at that point, because basically we know that people who believe that something is alive will not die for it. And so that's a form of evidence. That's a form of circumstantial evidence. And what you have in Christian tradition are all of these disciples that are dying for their profession that Jesus Christ not only died but was risen from the dead and was also seen, touched, and experienced. And of course, we can't forget the first skeptic that we see in the New Testament of the resurrection. Of course, was Thomas, and we know by Christian tradition that Thomas ended up being martyred in India.
Yeah, that way, if anyone is skeptical of the accounts, I'll grant that some of the accounts of the death of the apostles aren't as good as others, but there are some that are really good. And if you're looking for information on that, we have interviewed Sean McDowell on this show, who did write his dissertation on the deaths of the apostles and such. And something else about cognitive dissonance is that usually movements don't grow very much after the event takes place. They don't expand. But Christianity did just the opposite. It expanded greatly, and so much so that within 3 centuries it had pretty much taken over the Roman Empire, and about 3.5 centuries it was the official religion of the Roman Empire.
Yeah, Nick, I mean, and that's true. That's a good point. In that you have people who we see in the New Testament narratives were actually hiding from the Romans. What accounts for them all of a sudden in Acts chapter 2? They're like, this Jesus whom you've crucified, he is arisen from the dead. And they're these bold leaders. And so what happened? What changed them from cowering people that are fleeing and hiding from the Romans to ones that could care less about what the Romans or anyone else think, and powerfully proclaiming Jesus Christ as Lord? It's because they saw the resurrected Jesus Christ. They had an encounter and an experience with him. And what accounts for James, right, the half-brother who was a skeptic early on, the Gospels, Jesus, come on, stop this stuff. It's embarrassing. And then all of a sudden you see in Acts where he's the chief pastor of the Jerusalem church, what accounted for this? He saw the resurrected Jesus Christ, and we know that from Paul. Paul tells us the same. So we have this powerful, not only we've got this direct evidence from historical witnesses, but we also have this powerful circumstantial evidence. You've got James, the half-brother of Jesus, becoming the pastor. You have these recluses that are hiding from the Romans, becoming bold leader of the new movement. You've got the Apostle Paul, who changed from persecutor to the chief missionary. This is powerful circumstantial evidence for our faith.
Yeah, I've got a sister, and I can assure you she loves her brother very much. But if I started claiming I was the Messiah, she'd have me sent to the hospital saying he's suffering from Jerusalem syndrome. Please help him.
Right, yeah, that's a very good point.
Yeah. Now, we've got about 5 minutes left before we start wrapping things up here. So you've looked up the case here, you've looked up the evidence on these issues. Of course, you can't look up the evidence on every issue. There's still further research to be done. You acknowledge that at the end of your book. But what's your verdict based on what we've got so far?
I mean, I think that, of course, this was about Dr. Carrier's attacks or objections to the resurrection of Jesus Christ. What I see in this is that he's a very creative writer. He's a brilliant man, and I know he served our country in the Coast Guard. He's got a very nice education that, of course, he should be proud of, and he's a very active writer. Again, a great imagination, he's a great writer. He says a lot of interesting and creative things. But I think from an evidentiary perspective, it seems to me that he doesn't really understand the nature of evidence, and he uses evidence in his writings. He uses the term evidence in his writings, and what I quickly realize is he doesn't really understand what relevant evidence is from an evidentiary perspective. So I don't think he really offers any relevant evidence. He doesn't offer facts based on proof. He doesn't have any historical witnesses for proving his case. What he tries to prove about the New Testament writings is not in alignment with scholarly literature, particularly on the psychological works that we have coming from secular experts. It doesn't match up his alleged comparisons between Jesus Christ and these pagan gods. It doesn't match up with the New Testament resurrection accounts and what these mythical accounts say. So basically, he's got a lot of interesting information in here, but I don't think he understands what evidence really is from an evidentiary perspective. And I think he fails to prove his points.
Okay, if Carrier was listening to this, and he very well could sometime, what does he need to do in response, Finn?
Well, I mean, I think I would say this. I mean, I'm obviously not as busy of a scholar as he is, and I don't think that my writing is probably as good as his is. But I think what I do is I understand evidence. I think he should really kind of explore what evidence is in scholastic law. And I think he should make himself acquainted with that and maybe sort of reapproach what he has written in reference to these different things, these different attacks on the resurrection. I think that's what he should do. He should just go back to the drawing board as far as just looking into what actual evidence is and what actual evidence isn't.
Mm-hmm. And what would you say to his fans out here on the internet who pretty much hang on his every word, if they're listening?
I mean, I would just tell them to this sounds self-serving, but I really don't, because this is an academic work, I really don't get money for this. It's just basically the pleasure of getting it distributed and to get it seen. I would say start by looking at this book, delve into what Dr. Carey has actually said in relation to these different things, delve into accepted principles of evidence that are in this book, and just do your own assessment. Does he evidentially prove his case? That's what I would say for them to do.
And I always like to tell people, if you tell me you're a skeptic, you need to be just as skeptical of your own side as you are of the other side, or else you're just a selective skeptic.
Well, there you go.
Well, we don't have enough time to get into another section. The book is An Evidentiary Analysis of Dr. Richard Carrier's Objection to the Resurrection of Jesus Christ. Glad to know you went for short title. And
yeah. Go ahead.
Right now, it's out only on paperback. The cost is $43. It is a lot, but that's typical for this kind of literature, isn't it?
Yeah, and Nick, you can actually get it on the WIPF in stock site, WIPF in stock, and it's a little bit less. I think it's $34 there. I'm going to have some publishers' copies pretty soon, and I think I can beat that. But if you're interested in getting my price for it, you can reach me at ross@shieldyourfaith.org.
Is it possibly going to be coming out in Kindle sometime?
I did put that out. I think at some point it's going to be on DVD or a CD-ROM of some sort, I was told, with the World Evangelical Alliance. I don't think that it's actually out now.
Hey, do you have a blog, an email, website, way people can get in touch with you if they want to find out more?
Yeah. Hey, thanks a lot, Nick. It's shieldyourfaith.org. And I do, it's not just the real technical things that we're talking about today. I try to make it culturally relevant, and I also try to mix my career into it, so with a sense of humor. So yeah, shieldyourfaith.org, go to the blog, and again, ross@shieldyourfaith.org is how you would reach out to me by email.
Do you have any final thoughts you'd like to leave with a Deeper Waters audience?
Well, I would like first to say to you, thank you very much, Nick, and thank you for your work, and thank you for giving me this opportunity. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to maybe meeting you in person soon. And God bless you and all that you're doing. I know that you're in this community. You're a valued thinker and writer. So thank you, and thank you, Allie, for what you're doing. And also, I would just say for everybody, if you're a Christian, you really need to check into these matters to make sure that your faith is actually reasonable. And if you're an atheist, or a skeptic, I would just encourage you to just look into these matters as well. And I think you would find that the Christian faith is a reasonable faith.
Yeah, I like that you thanked my wife as well. And I'm sure if she was listening, she'd say, "What I'm doing, what am I doing?" And I would reply, and was saying that wives seem to have no idea just how much support they give their husbands in ways they don't realize.
Oh, yeah. I mean, without my wife, Andrea, I wouldn't have gone this far. I agree with you, Nick.
Well, Dr. Hickling, I'd like to thank you for taking time to come here, and I do hope to see you back here again sometime.
Hey, thanks for having me, Nick. God bless, buddy.
I'd like to remind everyone that next time we're going to have Dr. Jim Payton on, and Barnabas Powell of the local Orthodox Church here. They're going to be having a Protestant Orthodox dialogue. For now, I am Nick Peters, and I am signing off.